All right, so today we are going to go over some of the flood modeling results that Weston and Sampson have completed, specifically around the short duration high intensity storm in a specific catchment that is mostly in Westwood. And then we would like to answer your questions and sort of have a discussion about how you might use this type of information. Um, and as the presentation moves forward, please feel free to put questions in the chat, but we are going to hold answers until the end. Next slide. So just a reminder, we have a great team here. Thanks again to the town of Dedham for volunteering to be the fiscal agent for the last 2 years. And we really appreciate all of your participation in this project. Next slide. So just a refresher, this has been a 2-year project. We're coming to an end this June. We've been doing lots of public involvement and community engagement. We've been working with some of you on the climate adaptation collaborative and coming up with our work plan, which will be completed before the public meeting next month. We've got our community advisory group, which just had its last meeting this week. And again, at the public meeting, we'll be talking more about what they have been doing over the last 2 years. We've enhanced the watershed-wide flood model, and now we're in the last phase where we're evaluating additional watershed-wide flood mitigation strategies. And our project website is hosted by Neponset at Climate Adapt. So feel free to visit that. We try to update it as often as possible. So now I think I'm going to kick it off to Indrani to start us off.
Thank you, Carrie. Good morning, everyone. As Carrie mentioned, we're almost coming to the last lap of this phase of the project, and we're here to discuss high intensity short duration storms and how we have modeled them, what our findings are, focusing on this catchment area in Westwood. The reason why we're looking at these storms, the types of high intensity short duration storms are typically the storms that we get in the summer months, sort of now, now through June, July, the high burst storms that come in for a short duration that cause a lot of flooding in our neighborhoods. And those are the types of flooding issues that we've heard from you all through the duration of this project, across last phase and this phase. And we thought that it was warranted for us to take a closer look at the types of issues that we face in these storms. So we're looking at this area in Westwood, just sort of bordering 95 1A and 128 at that interchange there. We'll get a little bit more into the details of that. But a few of the reasons why we selected this catchment area in particular for evaluating the high intensity short duration storms are due to a few reasons. One was that we had really good GIS data from Westwood available, which didn't have too many data gaps. And to model the effect of high intensity short duration storms, we really need a better understanding of the drainage infrastructure in a city or town, because those are really the pinch points when rainfall comes in at over 3 inches per hour. The ability for the storm drains to collect water gets limited. So for us to be able to model the flood risks, we need to have a better understanding of where those drains and pipes and infrastructure is. We also selected this catchment because it had a lot of flooding. It had flood-prone areas that we had observed through the regional flood model that we had developed. And then through the regional modeling effort that we have done, we had identified sort of a prioritized list of catchments where we have seen, so two things, where we have seen flooding, where there is critical infrastructure, as well as where we have seen flood reduction strategies that we have evaluated in prior phases show benefits in flooding. And this catchment was one of those. So we selected, so that was another reason why we selected it. And another reason was this particular catchment in Westwood also has a combination of land use patterns that include sort of both highly developed areas as well as suburban wooded areas. And then there was also a variety of land ownership that was public as well as private, and that those would be interesting aspects to consider as we dive into solutions or potential strategies to mitigate flooding, which we will also discuss today. The next slide here is just sort of giving you a quick orientation of where this is. And so, as Carrie mentioned, primarily this catchment area is in is Westwood, and parts of it are in Dedham, and a small sliver of it is also in Norwood. Overall, it has about, as you can see here, 890 acres, approximately 30% impervious. And it is one of the smaller headwaters that is on the east of the Purgatory Brook. So the modeling approach that we used here, which Andy will get into a lot more in the details, really sort of covers looking at those high intensity short duration storms that have the varying duration from 2 hours, 6 hours. And we've also evaluated the 24-hour storms for continuity, because that's the duration that we've looked at throughout this regional modeling project that we've worked on. And in terms of the storm frequencies, we're looking at a 2-year storm, so like a storm that has a 50% chance of occurrence, a 10-year storm or a 10% chance of occurrence, and a 100-year storm or a 1% chance of occurrence. We will be talking a lot more about this, and Jenny's going to cover this more in detail. But what we are really looking at is, and for this particular catchment, is as part of the sensitivity analysis we had done, we've identified that the amount of flood volume that we need to mitigate for this catchment is just over 26 million gallons. And what that is essentially is we would need to make the 2-year storm of the future, or in 2070, no worse than the 2-year storm of today. If we are to make that future 2-year storm no worse than it is today, we'd need to manage over 26 million gallons of flooding in this catchment area, which is what we found in our analysis. So the modeling approach we developed for this, again, was started off from the larger regional submodel that we had, the larger regional model that we had that we developed for the watershed, but honing in on adding in more details in developing a submodel. So what we're going to show here, what Andy's going to describe, is developing of that submodel. We're explicitly modeling green and gray potential solutions so that we are able to better understand how the flooding is coming from, where the flood, how the flooding is generated, where the flooding is coming from, and how we can mitigate that with additional capacity to the drainage infrastructure as well as nature-based solutions. What we are using in this approach sort of stems again from the regional model. So we refined the regional model to add a lot more detail. We discretized it into over close to 480 subcatchments, and that has helped us better understand where the runoff is coming from that is affecting this particular catchment, as well as understand what the capacity issues are within the catchment. And then the types of strategies that we are evaluating, which also Jenny will cover later today, sort of range from a combination of green and gray that relate to both looking at improved conveyance as well as storage, as well as increased infiltration techniques. And with that, Andy, I'll hand it off to you to speak a little bit more about the modeling approach.
Thanks, Indrani. As Indrani mentioned, the submodel we built of the Westwood catchment is sort of standing on the shoulders of the Neponset River flood model, the NRFM, and it's sort of been a huge help in jump-starting development of the submodel. We've been able to inherit a number of things from the regional flood model, including all of the storm drains in the catchment that are 18 inches or larger, right? Those storm drains were incorporated in the full regional model, and so we've inherited those here, as well as the manholes associated with those drains. We've also been able to inherit some of the downstream boundary conditions in Purgatory Brook, right? So the bottom of this catchment is where this tributary flows into Purgatory Brook, and there's some backwatering that happens, and we wouldn't know the extents of that backwatering or the different flood levels associated with that backwatering if we didn't also have the regional flood model to build from. So that's been a huge help as well. And also just the assumptions and adjustments that were made to the regional flood model as it was calibrated and validated, and those were significant. All those assumptions and techniques that were learned through that process instead of having to reinvent the wheel, we were able to inherit those and streamline the development of this submodel. So that's been a big help. We did add a lot of detail, as Indrani mentioned, right? We were able to add the all the smaller storm drains, right? The 12s, the 8s, the 6s, and all the associated manholes. We were also able to add individual catch basins, which individual catch basins aren't represented at all in the regional flood model, but we have each one in this submodel of the Westwood catchment. We were also able to add in some of the smaller tributaries that aren't necessarily represented explicitly in the regional model, but we are able to add them in this submodel. And where the regional model had about a dozen, broke this catchment up into about a dozen drainage areas or subcatchments. Once we added all these storm drains and catch basins, we redelineated those subcatchments into over 480. So we've got a lot more refined understanding of where the runoff's coming from in the catchment. And of course, we replaced the 2D mesh that kind of sits on top of all the 1D stormwater infrastructure. The 2D mesh is responsible for overland flow, so modeling overland flow and representing what gets flooded and by how much. And so we were able to replace that 2D mesh with a much finer resolution, as you'll see in a second. Just a brief mention of the data sources that we used in developing the submodel. Obviously, we started with the NRFM. We have some really high quality stormwater GIS from Westwood and Dedham that we made great use of. We did some limited field investigations to plug a few small but significant data gaps. And we also pulled in publicly available data like LIDAR and wetlands inventory, land use patterns, and soil surveys. From that information, we were able to refine, starting with the 1D components of the model, right? The storm drains, the catch basins. As I mentioned, right, we incorporated 462 individual catch basins within this area, as well as over 260 manholes, 12 new stream crossings, 12 plus miles of storm drain, and even a water storage vault. So a lot more detail in this submodel. And you can see in doing this, we also refined sort of the extents of the catchment, right? Upon closer review, there's this area that's in the regional flood model that initially appeared to be part of the watershed, but in better understanding the small diameter storm drains that are out there and some of the more specific sort of infrastructure, we realized that this was not part of the watershed. And so there's some refinements like that as well. I mentioned we were able to replace the 2D mesh with a much finer resolution. This is a nice example. The 2D mesh actually covers the entire catchment area, which was not the case in the regional flood model. These models take a very long time to run. And so to manage that, we had to keep the 2D mesh only sort of down in the river valleys where the flooding would occur. With the submodel, we're able to represent the entire catchment area, while also having much smaller 2D cells. In fact, the average width of the 2D cells in the submodel is about 30 feet, which is about an order of magnitude smaller than in the regional flood model. So a lot more detail. And you can see that we're able to do even smaller cells in the areas where we're expecting a lot of flooding. Moving on to talking about rainfall, right? One of the primary goals of this submodel exercise is to understand how short duration, high intensity events produce flooding in a different way and cause different impacts than some of your longer duration, right? The 24-hour events that we have been looking at these past 2 years. You've probably seen this slide, right? This slide is focused solely on those 24-hour design events. We've presented this before, but we've selected the 2, 10, and 100-year storm event recurrence intervals for further evaluation. And we focused on the present day or baseline climate and a 2070 climate scenario. So there's this nice spread of design rainfall depths associated with those events. And you can see how those compare between 2070 and baseline, right? The the 500, what is a 500-year storm today, so to speak, will be a 100-year storm by 2070, and the 25-year of today will be the 10-year of tomorrow. So nothing terribly new here. We just sort of want to re-mention it to put the shorter duration storms into some context. These are the rainfall values we used in evaluating the short duration high intensity events. So you can see, I'll just describe what's going on in the graph here. There's 3 different recurrence intervals, right? The 2-year, 10-year, and 100-year storms. Those are the 3 different colored blues. We've got a group of columns over here that represent present day conditions and a group of columns over here that represent 2070 conditions. And then there's sort of 3 subgroups for 2-hour storms, 6-hour storms, and then the 24-hour storms that we've been modeling for 2 years now. So as you would expect, the total rainfall depths associated with the storms of 2070 are larger than their counterparts in a present day climate. That makes sense. You also see them increase, right, from a smaller storm like a 2-year to a 10-year to a 100-year. It gets bigger as the storm gets rarer. And you also see that the total rainfall depth increases with duration, right? A 100-year 2-hour event drops a little bit less than 4 inches of rain. But if a 100-year 6-hour event drops maybe 5.5 inches, and a 100-year 24-hour event drops a little over 8 inches. So you can see the rainfall depth increases with duration as well. However, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is with regard to the intensity of that rainfall. Right, even though the longer duration events had greater rainfall depths, they actually have lower peak intensities. The greatest peak intensities happen during those 2-hour events where they drop a lot of rain really quickly. And even though it's less rainfall, that intensity can cause more significant impacts in some areas. And that's what the submodel is all about, is understanding where are we seeing impacts from lots of rain happening over longer periods of time and just producing a lot of runoff, and where are we seeing impacts associated with those short bursts that even though they're not dropping a lot of rain, they're really intense and they're just overwhelming stormwater infrastructure. So that's kind of what is at the heart of this graph here, is showing that these shorter duration events actually have higher intensities, and those can cause issues. I wanted to just give you a sort of a taste of how the regional flood model compares to the submodel, right? We've talked about a lot of the improvements, and yeah, I think you can see them really strongly here, right? Obviously, a lot more infrastructure has been incorporated into the submodel, and you can see the refinement of the 2D mesh, right? Much greater resolution, much more detail in the submodel than is in the regional flood model. The regional flood model is not wrong; it just has less detail, less resolution. And you can see a lot of the areas that flood in the submodel are consistent with the areas that flood in the regional model, which makes sense. It's just because of the cell size, it looks more extensive than it is when we add that detail and are able to look at that in a more refined way. We also start to see areas of new flooding because we're adding more infrastructure, smaller infrastructure. And there's, right, as these 6- and 8-inch drains get overwhelmed and cause flooding, that shows up in the submodel in a way that it just can't in the regional flood model. And that's kind of what the submodel is all about. And the next 2 slides kind of show some nice examples, right? Here's an area where we see worse flooding during those longer duration storms, the storms that drop more rain and produce greater runoff volumes. So this is an area where the flooding is a result of flood volume, the amount of runoff. So on the left, we see it. This is the 2070 100-year event. This is the 2-hour version of it. So less total rainfall, but a higher peak intensity, and it produces some flooding. The same event, but a 6-hour variant, right? There's significantly more rainfall. It's a lower peak intensity, right? The peak intensity is actually less than half of the 2-hour, but there's another 2.5 inches of rain falling, and that in this area produces greater flooding, greater impacts. And even more so for the 20-hour version, right? Again, the peak intensity is halved from the 6-hour, but there's another 4 inches of rainfall. So a lot more runoff volume, which in this case causes greater flood volumes and greater impacts. That's not the case everywhere in this catchment. Here's an example of the opposite pattern, right? We have this 2-hour version. Again, it's the 2070 100-year event. But this is the 2-hour version, and that higher peak intensity is potentially overwhelming some of the infrastructure in this area, this corner of the catchment, and causing greater flooding extents. So even though the 6-hour and the 24-hour drop more rain, produce more runoff from the land surface, the infrastructure here is able to handle greater volumes of runoff better than higher peak intensities of runoff. And just to note, we obviously is a little dramatic. We're showing flooding of the interchange here. I'll just note that this is on the lower road. This is on the 95, not Route 1, but so it's kind of going under that overpass, right? But this, and again, it's the 2070 100-year, so it's a very large event. But this slide does a nice job of showing those areas that are affected more by peak runoff, high intensity rainfall, than they are by total runoff during longer storms. We see that to some degree associated with the critical infrastructure in the catchment as well, right? On the left, these are the results from the regional flood model, and on the right are the results from the submodel. We see flooding in largely the same places, but it's noticeable that it's less extensive because we have those much finer 2D cells. It's not shown to be quite so extensive, so we see that it's a little bit more localized. It's staying out of some of the roadways that the regional flood model suggested might be overtopped and experience flooding. But we do still see some potential impact to critical infrastructure in this area of the catchment, right? We have the Westwood Fire Department Station 2 here, right? As they leave there, if they need to travel across East Street, we do see some flooding, maybe up to about 2 feet in East Street during the 2070 100-year. So, right, that could potentially be an issue with response times. But we do see some potential impacts, which the submodel does a nice job of refining, so we have a better understanding of what those impacts are and potentially how to manage them. I'll zoom back out, right? We've kind of zoomed into some nice examples in specific corners of the catchment. I'll zoom back out and talk about the catchment as a whole. Let me orient everyone. This is showing the runoff volume. This is the total volume of runoff produced from the land surface. And we've broken it into sections here. So in this section, we're showing the 2-hour events. Here we're showing the 6-hour, and over here we're showing the 24-hour. The darker blue are the present day, and the lighter blue are the 2070 versions. And so we see, right, naturally, we see some significant increases going from the present day storm events to their 2070 counterparts, generally, 40 to 60% increases in runoff volume. And we also see some significant variation between the different durations, right? So for a 2-year, 2-hour storm of today, we see 18 million gallons of runoff, but that climbs considerably if you look at the 2-year, 6-hour, right? It's more rainfall, it's less intense, but it's more rainfall overall. We see the runoff volume increasing to 30 million gallons. And again, 2-year, 24-hour event, we see that climb to 50 million gallons. So on the catchment scale, we're seeing quite a lot more runoff volume being produced, but that doesn't tell the whole story, as we've seen. This slide shows the same information or similar information, but instead of runoff volume, what's coming off the land, this is showing the inundated area, which is, I think, more synonymous with what the impacts are, right? These are the acres of inundated area across the catchment. It's both developed and undeveloped areas. We haven't broken it out necessarily, but it's inundated area, so it's more akin to impacts to buildings and infrastructure. And we see quite a bit less variability here, right? So it's the same pattern. Here's the 2 hours, the 6 hours, and the 24 hours. And again, we see increases from present to future climate, generally between 15 and 30%. But it's interesting to look sort of at the 2-year, 2-hour versus the 2-year 6 versus the 2-year 24, there's a lot less variability. And in fact, it only climbs from 21 acres to 24 acres to 26 acres, a lot less variability. So what that tells us is if we see a significant increases of runoff volume from the land surface, but we don't see nearly as significant increases in inundated area, it tells us that there's a lot of sort of neighborhood scale areas in this catchment that are more strongly affected by peak intensity, peak runoff rates rather than total runoff volumes, right? Runoff volumes are increasing significantly, but the inundated area is not increasing nearly so much. So that tells us that the flooding problems in many areas in this catchment are affected by that peak runoff intensity. And that's the whole point of the submodel, is to better understand these different causes of flooding and where, which locales, which neighborhoods are affected predominantly by total runoff, right? Large amounts of rainfall, or peak runoff, high intensity rainfall, because that will inform solutions. I'll just sort of take a step back and summarize what we've seen on the last few slides, which is building from the regional flood model has been a huge help. It's allowed us to develop this submodel to be of high quality and to do so in sort of a cost-effective way, right? So the regional flood model allows us to understand the scale of flooding regionally and the connection between upstream and downstream communities. That the flooding in one community can affect the downstream community. We see that here to some degree with the relationship between Dedham and Westwood. The regional model also helps us to understand types of mitigation that might be effective. As you'll see in a minute, Jenny's got a nice slide to that effect. And it, like I said, it also helped really jumpstart the development of the submodel, providing that initial framework, right? Bringing in those large diameter pipes and subcatchments and boundary conditions. That's of great help. But the submodel allows us to provide a much more refined assessment of the local flood risk, right? Not only more specific and refined extents of flooding and the potential impacts, but also the causes, as I've spoken to, right? What's caused by lots of rain, what's caused by really intense rain. And that's where the value of the submodel comes in. And as we've seen, we see examples throughout the catchment of flooding impacts caused by both types of event, both types of runoff issues. And so the next step is to start to look at solutions that can address both causes of flooding. Hand it off to Jenny.
So we're using this model to help define our next step, which is to really identify those flood mitigation strategies. And we're looking at nature-based solutions as well as gray solutions. So thinking about, piped solutions, diversion, increasing diameters of pipes, inlet capacity, as well as pumping, as well as, storage, right? Like underground storage or surface storage, whether that's storage or infiltration. And we're using, all of this information to sort of guide that process. And it's really helps us sort of hone in on specific areas, like where is the flooding, where can we capture water, where can we hold back water, and really think through the details. So just as Andy mentioned at the beginning, or Indrani mentioned, and then Andy also, I think, mentioned, our mitigation target is 26.5 million gallons. And just for folks who like some math presented to them, here's the equation, right? So we're taking the 2070 2-year, 24-hour storm. We're subtracting the 2-year, 24-hour storm that's sort of the baseline or present day storm in million gallons. We're thinking about volume. We're not, we do evaluate impacts to flooding as well as in peak runoff, but for this, we're looking at volume. And the way we could achieve mitigation for 26.5 million gallons is basically reducing 65% of impervious cover. in this catchment, which is a lot. There's also a lot of DOT property here, as you guys saw, right? We have we have I-95 and Route 1. So the other methods are to store more water on or under impervious surfaces or pervious areas. And both of those parameters in this catchment are pretty similar, right? You're looking at almost 2.5 inches of storage or infiltration. So we're working towards this target. I just want to be clear. I think this is a really impactful slide, and I know Jason from Dedham has seen this before and commented on it. Like, this is something I can, give to my elected and appointed officials to really help them understand, like, how much water are we talking about? 26.5 million gallons is almost 62 football fields. That's only storing a depth of 1 foot, right? So it could be less football fields if you have 3 feet, but that's a lot of football fields in this area. So we're looking at sort of catchment-wide strategies and site-specific strategies. On the catchment-wide scale, we're doing a whole evaluation for nature-based solutions, and some of you who have been in meetings with us over the past few weeks have seen that detail. We're also looking at storage and infiltration, which are more of a gray strategy, but can be tied to a green strategy, right? You can have a surface practice that's green, and then it can go into underground. And then we're looking at really site-specific areas based on the modeling. So catch basins, inlets, thinking about whether you can infiltrate at catch basins and what that gets you, upsizing drains or rerouting drains. The nature-based solution types we're considering are pretty extensive. This is the list we're looking at, but generally speaking, we're looking at areas for bioretention or rain gardens, bioswales, effectively linear rain gardens, planter boxes, thinking about porous pavement or pervious areas, permeable parking, infiltrating subsurface, as I mentioned, tied to a surface practice, restoration of wetlands or opportunities to expand sort of volumetric water storage, looking at restoration of urban parks or forest areas, creation of urban gardens, restoration of water bodies, restoration of the riparian area, harvesting rainwater, and constructing wetlands, and even thinking through potential opportunities for green-blue roofs, which are certainly a challenge with structural requirements. So with that, I think, Carrie, we are going to hope the group could have a talk about the content and right, next steps.
Sorry, my tech is a little lagging. Um, yes, so I don't see any questions in the chat, but why don't I first ask if anybody wants to ask Indrani or Andrew or Jenny anything about this submodel.
Hey, this is Addison from Boston Water and Sewer. Great job with the model. It looks amazing. You did a very great job explaining, and thank you for doing those really short storms. I think those are super interesting and important. And I guess my question is, how does that affect the total time of inundation, and what impact will that have on moving forward?
That's a great question. We, we've that's come up briefly over the last couple of days putting these together. But generally, we see longer duration flooding from those longer duration, greater volume events. We tend to see shorter duration flooding and impacts associated with the short duration, high intensity events, and that has a lot to do with the proximal causes, right? When you get sort of nuisance flooding associated with those summertime thunderstorms, those really intense storms, the ponding may only happen for 30 minutes to an hour, and then by dinner time it's dissipated, versus these larger storms that last 24 hours or longer even, right? Mother's Day, I mean, towns were experiencing direct impacts from flooding for an event like Mother's Day storm back in 06 for several days. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think it's pretty important consideration when
Yeah.
trying to plan for stuff like this.
Absolutely.
I will add that the storm that caused havoc at the Norwood, that caused a lot of damage at the Norwood Hospital in 23 July of I'm probably getting my year wrong. Ian, help me there, please. But that
2020.
2020, thank you. The helm of COVID. That was certainly a type of this type of storm that we are trying to understand better what the risks are and what the potential solutions could be for a storm event like that.
I would just add that was it was terrible for folks in Norwood, but it was interesting hydrologically, because if you looked at the Norwood stream gauge, which is not really even too far downstream of downtown Norwood, that storm was almost like a nothing on the river stream gauge, but it was enough to really do a huge amount of damage, obviously, in the downtown area.
Very poignant.
And I just wanted to draw people's attention to the chat. There was a question about whether or not this would be added to the interactive web page, and Indrani has responded that yes, will be included in the viewer and the story map, which will be completed, by the end of June or earlier. Any other questions about the submodel? Then maybe I'll ask, how useful would this type of modeling be in your community? And how might you use it for your more local planning? Or what did you think about the information that we were able to glean from the submodel versus the regional model? What kind of information would be most useful to you? Time of inundation obviously sounds like that would be useful.
All right,
Anyone?
Carrie. I'll help you out, Carrie.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris
Appreciate
in
it.
Foxborough. So I think thinking about obviously I think a lot of us in our towns know where we have this kind of short-term flooding from these short duration but high impact storms that we've been seeing a lot lately. But being able to identify them and show them across the town, and then what the need is to fix those problems, what the downstream analysis might show as far as, do I need from an 18-inch to a 24-inch, what that system needs in order to not have 3 feet of flooding under the railroad bridge on Cocassa Street in Foxborough. I know that it dissipates in 30 to 45 minutes, but in that time frame, people think they can drive through it and they're stuck in 3 feet of water. So I know that I have a very shallow drain line. I've got 4 catch basins that all go into one, and it's a 12-inch line, and that's it. So kind of, I think maybe what the future is beyond that. It's one thing to identify all that localized flooding in those short duration storms, but what's the fix? Would probably be the next step, and might be more helpful for communities, especially when you're looking for funding to fix that drain system, whether you have a utility fee or not, looking for capital funding or even just in-house projects that we can do with our own DPW to upsize those systems? Or is it infiltration? Are we able to get the water just back underground? We've identified some of that through our MVP program, but we haven't really done any of the construction side of it yet. So just some of my thoughts, maybe spur the conversation a little bit, help you out.
Chris, that's really well said. It's
Thanks,
Jenny
Chris.
from Weston and Sampson. I think your point too about like what is the fix in that specific situation too. It's nice to know like what does 2070 look like when you're thinking about investing in infrastructure that's going to be in the ground for another 100 years plus, right? You don't want to just fix current day problem. You want to fix future problems.
Right. We generally in the public sector, public works, I mean, some towns have started spending money on drainage. We're required to through MS4, but it's still a struggle to get that money from school buses or sidewalks or road paving or some of the other work that's out there that takes priority. So being able to do it once and protecting ourselves for the next 50 plus years would be a big step and selling point for the towns that are trying to get that money.
And Ilex has sort of echoed that in the chat and said, having the information about what the extent of the mitigation that's necessary is helpful to present to both the public and local leaders. Jason?
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if you had a chance, because I came on a little bit late. Were you able to talk about how Dedham had used the flood modeling? No? Okay. So I got a couple things, two things. So the flood modeling and the work that's been done to date, one of our advisory committees that was recently formulated by the select board to look at our drinking water supply, because Dedham is, their water supply is done by aquifers through the Dedham Westwood Water District, and we only have a connection to the MWA for emergencies. So we depend on an aquifer for our water supply. And we had a group put together to take a look at, what is the effect of our aquifer with future developments moving along and losing open space to development. And as they started to get into the discussion, started to look at the recharge that we're doing with some of the stormwater improvements with our retrofits for our MS4, but then also starting to talk about flood mitigation and the effects of flooding in the future in terms of water quality and how it can replenish the groundwater supplies, which is what we use. Because we all know when you have extreme flooding, the opportunity to pre-treat these is solely left to the devices of the soil conditions that you have as it infiltrates back into there. So they use this modeling. I sent them all the information, and we have it for both the Neponset and the Charles River side. And it was very instrumental in them to actually see the problem and to recognize that there's something that we need to be forward thinking about in 2070. So it was good in that aspect. It had an indirect relationship to what they were studying, and it was available to them. So that really helped them in terms of making decisions and trying to create a formula on how we can be better moving into the future. The second part of this is more something that I'm looking forward to, because now as we're starting to see what moves the needle in terms of mitigating flooding, we started off with green nature-based solutions, and yeah, they had a little something, but not as much as we had hoped. And now we're starting to see gray infrastructure starting to move the needle some more. So I think we're getting very close to starting to have a discussion where, maybe a future grant enables us all to get back together again and develop some regulatory requirements for those that are doing development and redevelopment, and define an area that is contributory to these flood areas, not only within the flood area, but those that contribute upland, and create a strategy where they're going to have to do their part to help mitigate those effects in the future. So I really think this is going down a road where we can use this to get the private properties that are so hard to get a hold of and grab them and grab their attention, and use them to help us do the work that needs to be done. We all know that we have a major play in terms of impervious area with our roadway systems. And it's a challenge just for us to do our own thing, because we're all implementing infiltration practices. We're all trying to do those things that may be under foster control plan or just impaired water body that we're trying to do our due diligence from. But we all know that different towns and cities have different availability within their right of ways. So as much as we can and want to do, some of us are lacking open space and right of way space. So it does kind of unfortunately go back onto private property owners that have the ability to do that. So I'm really looking forward to the discussions that come out of this moving forward, because I think we're really starting to get close on those things that we can do to make a change.
Thanks, Jason. And that sort of dovetails with some of the conversations that have been happening around the collaborative work plan. You know, those regulatory changes are pretty high up there in terms of priority, and trying to make sure that development and redevelopment are doing what they need to do and are being done right. Ian.
I was just going to ask a question of the Weston and Sampson team, which we've asked before about the regional model. You know, like, is this sort of the level of detailed analysis you feel like you need to get to if you're going to actually use these sort of modeling results for a regulatory purpose? I mean, is this where you would want to be, or is it even farther than this, or maybe this is even more than you need to do that? I'm just curious, and we won't hold you to it, but.
So I think we've shown in some of our previous results, Ian, that the point that Jason was making about using new development and redevelopment as opportunities for flood mitigation, we've demonstrated that the benefits of that policy with some of our runs that we have done through the regional model. For example, we've shown what happens when we do ask for a more stringent stormwater mitigation, peak runoff mitigation that is not a one-to-one, but like if we have the 25-year, if we have new development, redevelopment projects, make the 25-year storm peak no worse than the 2-year storm peak, right? We've done some of those runs where we have demonstrated that effective adoption and collective adoption of more stringent stormwater policies could lead at a sort of a neighborhood scale, can lead to certainly improved flood reduction, and sometimes quite noticeable flood reduction benefits have been observed. So some of that we've been able to demonstrate with some of the model runs that we've done at the regional scale. When we get down to looking at using the model to inform flood elevation considerations that may be factored into zoning considerations, and that is a level of detail that needs more refinement, sort of at the submodel, and perhaps more at a community by community scale. The modeling framework that we have developed and sort of the larger regional model with the boundary conditions upstream, downstream, that we've developed the framework. But if we were to use it for more climate resilient zoning considerations, such as, you know, some of the considerations that Cambridge is using or Boston's using, that will require a higher level of detail and resolution to sort of inform more specific policies or elevation considerations. Andy, Jenny, looking at you
You
both.
know, I think you've nailed it. In my mind, the regional model can be and has shown to be useful for understanding policy changes that may move the needle on mitigation, and the types of policies that would be most effective, right? One of the key findings last spring was this is going to take everybody everywhere all the time. It's not something that full mitigation cannot be achieved simply by focusing on publicly owned roadways. That's not enough. So there's great value in the regional flood model there, and that the submodels can fine tune those policies on a community or sub-watershed basis. And the submodels are also really useful for concepting and supporting permitting of individual gray infrastructure and green infrastructure solutions right? Individual projects, a submodel is useful in supporting those, and and potentially getting additional grant funding to flesh out and build those solutions.
Great. Who else has a question? Comment?
I'll make one, Carrie, if no one on the municipal side has any comments. One of the things we've seen with green infrastructure from the Charles, and you'll see this in the slides that are coming on the 5th of June, is, when you look at them on a catchment scale, you're really not seeing flood mitigation, right? It's not doing a lot. It's moving the needle very little. And what we're seeing when we zoom in is we can better place green infrastructure practices and nature-based solutions. We can intercept flows that are under these smaller storms that create localized flooding. And we can actually change that localized problem. And that submodel helps us identify and evaluate that. And I think, that's an interesting hone in on all this work we've been doing, right? We've looked at these larger scale theoretical ideas around green infrastructure. And I know when we work with communities, right, we're still far from implementation in many ways, right? Maintenance is such a concern, cost is such a concern, community, what's the right word? Support is such a concern, taking away parking is such a concern. But we're seeing sort of proof again and again that there are benefits here from a localized flood perspective, and a street, a small neighborhood, a intersection, etc. And I did want to reiterate that, but that the goal, right, that we want to achieve with this giant volumetric storage is really going to take that large thinking about changes in policy and how when we're redeveloping now or modifying any existing development, even if it's not an active process to redevelopment, right? Like RDA, perhaps, you would be really thinking about this like large scale storage underground for impervious or pervious areas. And I don't know if folks have thought about how they really believe this is going to proceed in the next like 20 to 50 years. Are these goals reasonable? Is this mitigation goal of 2 years achievable? What's it gonna take locally to get there? Have I gone off the rails? I apologize.
Anyone? I mean, I think previously, people have talked about, the resources. I mean, this is really expensive work, and you really need that support from local leadership and residents, and the public, and to really prioritize this, and make sure you have that mix of nature-based and gray strategies.
Well, Carrie, if folks aren't into chatting,
Yeah.
maybe we just wrap up because we have a few more slides and we have 3 minutes left. Cool.
Sounds good. All right. So everyone, please make sure that you look at the municipal in-kind match tracker. I filled in a lot from earlier in the fiscal year, but would love it if you could just confirm. I can be missing hours that you've spent, or time you've spent talking amongst yourselves. I've only been able to capture the meetings and an estimate of how much time you spent preparing. And please confirm your hourly rate. MVP sets a minimum of 60. So, I just want to make sure that anybody who bills out at higher than 60 gets that in accurately. We have our last flood model meeting on the 5th, again at 10:30, and you've received a calendar invitation for that yesterday. And then we have our final public meeting on June 16th. That too will be virtual. It's in the evening, and we'd love for you to come attend that. Pre-registration is required for that one, and you can use that QR code or look at the Neponset website under events. So I think those are the main things. That public meeting will wrap up everything. We'll do an overview of everything that you've accomplished over the last 2 years. All right. Well, with that, thank you so much for being here. Please feel free to email us with any questions you think of later. And we'll see you on the 5th.
Thank you.
Nice seeing everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.